Hello, and welcome everybody to the January 17th meeting of the Gateway API Gamma working group. As always, Kubernetes code of conduct rules are in effect, so please treat each other respectfully. And with that, yeah, we can, the meeting notes are linked in the invite. Feel free to add your name to the list of attendees, and we have an open agenda, so feel free to add any topics you'd like to discuss to the agenda, and we'll go through that. All right, we can start off with a recap of last meeting. It's pretty brief. I think we might have ended a little bit early last time, but the main topic was around Gateway API Gamma conformance and how we go about expressing that versus having concepts like what is core for any mesh that wants to implement Gamma versus having some functionality that may be extended conformance, similar to how Gateway API is broken up, and how those interact with the existing conformance levels, knowing that not all meshes will support north-south gateway, or how the north-south implementations that don't want to support Gamma be able to express that. So we had a discussion about that, and there were a couple suggestions that came out of that. One is the idea of some kind of like conformance profile. So this may also be useful for differentiating L4 from L7 support for north-south gateways, as well as being able to split out Gamma into a separate test suite, essentially. So that was one of the more near-term ideas as we start working on building up conformance tests for Gamma functionality. Then one of the more longer-term ideas that seemed to have broad interest was building some kind of machine-readable way for implementations to advertise their feature support. So one suggested path was doing that on gateway class. There's also some discussion around potentially being able to do that in a more general purpose or abstract way that could be useful to implementations or projects beyond the Gateway API project. Similar to how we first introduced reference grant for our purposes, but then that's starting to be adopted more broadly for, I think, storage. But yeah, this is scheduled for further discussion in the Gateway API meeting on Monday next week. So definitely catch the recording from last time if you're interested in hearing more about that, and feel free to join the discussion next week as we discuss this further. And then the thing that came up was a brief discussion of metrics. This is something that is not a current goal for us to focus on. The hope is kind of any early effort might channel towards the Open Telemetry project and kind of give them enough runway to see what comes out of that before we endorse any kind of formal adoption of that spec or really dedicate any kind of a significant attention to that. All right. Are there any questions on recap or anything that I missed before we move on to the rest of the agenda? I'll take that as we can move on. So yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for the discussion we've had over the past couple of weeks about the PR that John wrote for expanding the scope of Gamma routing to include client or consumer defined routing. It's the namespace boundaries PR that's linked here in 1493. I think that we're at a pretty good point now where we've had significant discussion. We seem to have rough agreement on this is something that many implementations can support in some capacity. A few folks seem particularly interested in this. I know Linkerd folks seem very much interested in supporting this functionality. So yeah, I'm hoping to give it a final review, hopefully later today. But it seems like it's out of state where it really just needs a final LGTM, and we should be good to get this landed. And we know that there's the caveat on this is we hope to potentially explore kind of more advanced merging of consumer-defined rules with producer-defined rules, but that's not in scope yet. Kind of just to make this a little first pass easier to implement is kind of the hope. Yeah. Are there any comments or questions on that before we continue? So that's kind of like what has been kind of our emphasis for the past couple of weeks is progress and getting this to a point where it is near resolution.
I have a quick question. Can you hear me? Quick nod.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I haven't been able to make these meetings in the past few weeks, but I was just wondering for this specific PR where we want to basically overwrite routes in the consumer namespaces, have we talked at all about more advanced matching here? So another thing that we want to do in Linkerd is when we have a consumer namespace, we might not want all workloads to match a specific route. So we might want them to use the server route instead, or the server defined route. Have there been any conversations on this topic? I know John opened up an issue, but I'm just curious if it was brought up at all in the meetings.
I can answer a bit. It's a relatively controversial issue because consumer overrides, I mean, in Istio we support them and we support them for quite well and at a very high cost. It is extremely difficult to implement consumer overrides without having a consumer sidecar, which has means basically running an extra proxy, which is add latency, CPU cost, and so forth. So it will be very useful to have them as optional. We will continue to support them in Istio for foreseeable future because of backward compatibility in virtual service. But we are hoping to reduce the use of client overrides to minimum necessary. And to identify this minimum necessary before going all in with everything. I don't know if Linkerd has any plan to stick with sidecars forever, or you guys are, or other vendors are planning to also look for alternatives that are more efficient. But I think that should be the main criteria about anything that we allow to be overridden from client. How we can represent it in an architecture that is not necessarily tied to sidecars, because some things can be implemented with an egress gateway, for example. I mean, having client go to an egress gateway which can apply policies, which is required no matter what for the egress side. And few things can be applied on the server side proxy, not timeout, but some other things. Any of these things will be wonderful to prioritize and to do first and to kind of have all vendors support them. But anything that strictly require a sidecar and there is no reasonable fast implementation that is only without a client sidecar, I would again keep it optional as much as possible.
I think that the intent of this would be to avoid any kind of explicit requirement on a sidecar. While that's certainly one model which many meshes will use to implement it, I think you mentioned like a namespace scope egress gateway could be another way to implement it, and that seems, I don't think that there's anything that would prevent that implementation from my read of this PR. But yeah, also being able to like scope to specific services or workload. I'll defer to John on, I don't recall if this is in there currently or if it's something we may want to do as a follow-up, but it certainly seems useful both for the Linkerd purpose of being able to like write specific rules for one, but also for the Istio purpose of being able to say only opt-in services that are deployed with the sidecar or something like that.
Yeah, I would say to answer a few points. So the direct question, was there more discussion about this? I didn't see anything. There was a lot of discussion on the PR. I split that out to an issue so we don't lose it once the PR is merged. I think we should continue to have that. To Costin's point, I don't know if this was clear to others, but there is if we consider the non-sidecar case, there is a substantial difference between namespace and specific pods, because if you have a namespace gateway, then that means having one set of routing rules versus having potentially infinite. Not saying we shouldn't do it, just to clarify that concern there. But I also think, we can potentially have optional features as well, certainly for the short term while we're in super experimental mode. just kind of see what works and what doesn't. In Istio in particular, we do actually have this feature, and it's so obscure and no one uses it that even I didn't know about it until like working on the project for like 3 years. So it is one of those things that sounds extraordinarily useful. In my experience, it's not actually as useful in practice, but that could just be, something about Istio makes users tend to use it or not. So I don't want to say that's useless. It just, in our experience, it wasn't as important as we thought. But it would be good to explore.
All right, cool. Well, thank you all for the answers.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So next up, I kind of want to open the floor to what to tackle next. And I'm both interested in ideas from various implementations in terms of like what are some of the higher priority things for y'all that you want to see out of Gamma, as well as kind of like an open call for any volunteers or folks interested in stepping up as a champion to take on any of the remaining tasks in this milestone, which we've kind of collected as a place of, let's say, rough edges before Gamma is quote unquote ready for wider adoption. Or if there are things that are not covered in here that we should add. Yeah. And I can share my screen to open that in a second.
Well, for me personally, I just want to, I'm fine doing other stuff, but my focus is just getting this routing stuff progressed and, having tests, conformance tests, people start implementing it, that sort of thing. So that to me is my top priority.
And I would add continuing the discussion on egress, MTLS, and authorization, because we already started and it's probably very useful. MTLS and authorization.
I'm working with Rob on conformance checks, and probably the one before the last one, which is defining conformance levels. So I don't know where this milestone is expected. What's the deadline for this milestone? But I'm probably gonna work on the.
I don't think we have a specific date deadline yet, but I know that the hope is to get this into a state where it is ready enough for API to pass like API review as part of the Gateway API 070 release, whenever that gets scheduled for.
Yeah. So yeah, probably gonna work on it, and I'm also gonna start working on how to present conformance test results in a centralized place, so we can track what implementation conform with what feature.
That's great to hear. Since it sounds like there's a lot of interest in conformance tests, I know Keith has expressed some interest in working on that too. Is there any venue for collaboration or issue or PR that folks should direct their attention to for that? Or is this not quite that far along yet?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Oh, just if there's any issue or PR or branch that folks should look at to start collaborating on for conformance tests, or if there's something more informal than that, like a Slack thread or other discussion for where folks can pick up work to hopefully start moving this forward.
Yeah, want to take it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things here. One, absolutely should collaborate as early as possible. But I think what Lior is focused on up front is just taking the conformance test we already have and finding a way to represent the results, centralized reporting. And I think what Keith is working on, or John or somebody is building out tests for mesh. And I think those two need to like intersect at some point. But I think they're sufficiently separate and at first that we can like have separate designs that merge together at some point, I hope.
Cool.
Yeah, so my understanding, Keith's not here, right? Yeah. So Keith is working on getting kind of, I hate the word framework, but like the test framework for mesh so that we can run mesh tests, which will probably present itself as just like a hello world test. And then he may need some help right now if people are interested, but after we get that core in, it should be very easy to distribute actually writing test cases. So at that point, anyone interested, it will be really low-hanging fruit, I think, to go add test cases for all the different parts of the spec. I'm not sure where he is at in getting kind of the core in, though. I think he's a busy guy.
Cool. Well, that sounds like great work. I'm excited to see that happening. And yeah, it sounds like potentially in a couple of weeks, we'll have kind of a wider open area for folks to contribute to that once we kind of like get the groundwork in place. So that's really exciting. Definitely glad to hear that. And yeah, it'll be good to see this work start coming together. That's the end of my scheduled agenda. Is there, or are there any other topics that folks are interested in talking about today?
Yeah, so I'm actually hoping to ask a quick question if for Costin, if they're still there. So I was hoping to actually just kind of understand a little bit more about how Ambient Mesh is working in some cases. So Kevin, I work at Buoyant with Matei on Linkerd. And so for the question that Matei asked about matching in the consumer namespace, and you had brought up about making sure that that sort of thing is not reliant on having a sidecar. So I need to understand a little bit more about Ambient Mesh and what's involved with it. But wouldn't that be at a point where you already have a proxy running on that node? Like, isn't this a little past? Like, my understanding of Ambient Mesh is that you get things like MTLS without having the per node proxy. But as soon as you go into things like policy or just figuring out what to use for server override or something, don't you need a proxy at that point, in which case you can do the matching?
John is probably the best to answer this because he's main engineer working on Ambient.
Yeah, I can answer if
Okay.
you like. So the primary, okay, so I mean the baseline is you have like the node proxy, you only get MTLS. There's basically no APIs except for like network policy. So it's kind of irrelevant for gateway discussion. And then the primary thing that happens next is user will deploy a producer, what we call waypoint proxy. Today that's technically bound to a service account specifically, but we might also add namespace bound ones because usually people don't care that much about service account granularity in our experience, or at least some people don't, so for the simplicity. So with just a producer waypoint proxy, that means all your incoming requests are going through it, but your egress requests are not. So that would only allow producer rules, right? In our experience, those are the most common, the most important. And so that is what we're focusing on as both like we're implementing that now and the rest later. And we think that's what most people will use. We will also probably add the kind of egress waypoint, which is most likely actually the same proxy, just running in two different modes simultaneously. And in that case, like say you wanted to have a consumer override that, I don't know, adds a timeout or something. If we apply it at the namespace level, that's easy, regardless of if we do the namespace or service account proxy. I would just apply it to all of those. If we were to say it applies to this specific pod, and then we have 10 different pods all using the same waypoint and 10 different policies, then it becomes tricky. And it's not impossible to implement, but it's very inefficient. We kind of had the same problem on the other side with authorization policies, because our old API applied to specific pods. And we realized that, okay, it's actually really bad to do load balancing and then authorization instead of authorization, then load balancing in terms of complexity and implementation and whatnot. So similar issues there. If we were to say, like, you can override only at the service account level, and we decide that we're never going to do like namespace wide waypoints, maybe it's a different story. That would kind of lock us into a kind of weird API, and then lock us into what we can, the scope of the waypoint, if that makes sense.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay.
I will say though, like in the API today with policies, like there's the idea that, some policies can attach to gateway, namespace, HTTP route, whatever. Some other implementations can only do some of those. So it's not unheard of to say that, we could attach these policies at more granular levels in some implementations than others.
Yeah. Okay. All right, thanks. Yeah, it makes a little more sense.
Yeah, I think that it's important to the model I have in mind is that every time you have policies, L7 policies, you need to do L7 parsing. So that involves having a gateway and having overhead. The least overhead you have, the better it is, and low cost, lower latency increase and everything else. So and also more opportunity to have a larger scale that scales up, scales down. You have more control if you keep this gateway not as a sidecar but as a separate entity that can be dynamically scaled. Because that's the other problem with the sidecars is that you how much you allocate. It's very difficult to put the right amount of CPU and memory to it.
Are you guys interested to explore this model too? Just curious.
No, we haven't really gotten into any serious discussion about doing that yet. Maybe at some point in the future for certain things, but it's not something that's really on the radar right now.
Got you. Thank you.
Yeah.
But if I can,
I've been messaging Matei on the side about wishing that there was more for me to read up on about it. I feel like the ambient mesh side of things, I'm aware of a few things that have been helpful to read, but it's still something that I want to understand a little bit more. So if there are any great docs that maybe I'm missing or something, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, we have 3 blogs on Istio.io. Have you seen those? Like a security deep dive, introduce ambient,
I've read the security deep dive.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and we also have a Istio Ambient Explain book. That would also explain some of the questions you were asking, so that might be interesting. We are in the midst of actually refreshing our contents, which we should in the next few months and weeks, and we'll probably provide more contents with the latest development, because the development we've done was in September, so it was a little bit updated. The blogs was a little bit updated, but from an architecture point of view, should give you a good idea of what's going on at a high level.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I was going to say the old stuff for that very high level it's useful, but some of the things I mentioned we just decided last week, so it's still pretty in flux. So I can share some of those docs if you want, but we don't have a higher level summary yet, but I think we will and should, obviously, as we solidify some of these decisions we've made.
All right, awesome.
One more point I want to put on this discussion. Regardless of you adopt or interested in ambient or similar model, one thing that will be very useful to explore and to look into is having a common protocol and common concept of security. We are using this HTTP2 connect based protocol, which is also standardized by ATF and in some form. And having interoperability, so components from different vendors can work together. So it's not only Istio only or some vendor X only mesh, but you can have some parts of the mesh, some clusters using one vendor and common protocols. That will be super useful regardless. I mean, you can keep sidecars, you can use whatever you use, but it will be useful to have at least one mode where everyone is using HTTP2 and streaming over HTTP2 plus QUIC in future.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
if you have faster, better alternative protocols, that's wonderful. I mean, I'm not saying you should drop all the other protocols, but everyone should support HTTP2 at least, and
Yeah.
with similar understanding of security and you know, certificates and other stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been following this with kind of like vague interest for the multi-cluster use case, basically. So not so much within a cluster, but I'm curious if it could be applied to a different scope, because it feels like we have similar needs of like transiting securely through a gateway and then having the cluster actually routes off to pods, like with a waypoint-ish type thing. It seems like a similar use case, even though it's a different scope.
That's the main reason. I mean, we want to interoperate with, you know, not only clusters, but you know, external infrastructure, maybe you know, home devices. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Matter standard. I'm very excited about it, and it's also based on encryption and security. So,
sorry, what was that?
Matter, for Internet of Things devices. It's a new standard from Amazon, Google, Apple, and everyone to have light bulbs use security, basically. Putting the mesh on where it's needed the most at home.
Cool. If you can add any relevant links to that in the notes, we would definitely appreciate that if that is applicable to us at all, potentially. All right. Is there anything else that folks want to discuss during this time?
I have something that's kind of it's not really
Yeah, I'm
even
interested
gateway
in
related, but I was going to ask
hearing your
everyone
question.
here anyways, individually, pretty much. I've been looking at controllers, and kind of one of the issues I've had is we're trying to be very granular in terms of something changing and then us doing work. So for example, if we considered a simple controller that kind of merges pods and services into endpoints, if like a service annotation changes, a naive implementation would then go re-reconcile everything related to that service. A terrible implementation would go reconcile the entire world on every change, right? And an optimal one would realize immediately, like, that's totally irrelevant, skip that. In many ways, I found that it parallels like the problems that like JavaScript frameworks do of like, okay, like this field change, like what do I need to go re-render? I'm just wondering, is anyone like solving those types of problems in their controllers or thinking about it? I would love to copy something instead of making something. It's basically what I'm thinking.
I think that's a really interesting observation. It almost, we are not solving this in any better way currently, but it makes me think of some kind of like batching, like game engine type thing where you're like rendering updates at like a lockstep rate, rather than response to every change.
Yeah, I have some ideas, but yes, Keith, the Kubernetes React framework is incoming. I actually thought about writing a controller in React to see what it would look like, but I haven't got there yet. But that's actually exactly what I'm thinking. It's like similar type thing. But I was surprised that I hadn't seen anything like it, but maybe now we will see something like it if I get around to getting a prototype.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, but it's something that I've also been thinking about a little recently. We have something similar in Linkerd's policy controller, where right now we're pretty much, when something changes in the namespace, we're just re-indexing like everything each time there's a change. And it's been on my mind also a little bit recently on if there's a better way to do that. Even just working with like applying statuses to resources. Right now it's looking at, it has to kind of relook at all the resources. And it would be nice if there was a way to, you know, really just figure out what needs to change specifically without looking at everything. But I don't have too much to add to the question or to an answer.
Yeah, I've got some thoughts here. It's an interesting problem. The thing with React is that it's able to take advantage of the hierarchical nature of the DOM for its diffing algorithm, and that's really the magic of how React's able to be so performant and rendering those updates for just a single resource, for a single tree of resources. So effectively, I think the core problem in the Kubernetes world is to build a tree of all the various resources and dependencies if you wanted to use the React diffing algorithm, or create a new algorithm that can be as performant and efficient with objects that are stored in the Kubernetes. That's Kubernetes cloud native, I guess. It's a very interesting problem, and I hadn't thought about it until you brought it up, but it's very fascinating.
Yeah, the tree thing is definitely like, I think everyone has the tree, it's just implicit. So making it more explicit and then using that. I was even thinking like outputting the tree as like a .graphis format, so you can like visualize your whole controller and whatnot would be cool.
Yeah, exactly. I almost wrote something like that a couple years ago, but never got around to actually doing it.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if a tree or anything like that can help, because it's a problem of semantics. I mean, if any smallest change somewhere may impact arbitrary things that we don't know, you don't know ahead of time, and nobody can predict what will change in annotation on a field will require to change in other parts of the mesh of different different controllers or different things that need that field. So I think the real problem is write amplification and how to avoid it by, making sure that the leaves get the changes identical as, only the resource that is changed, and can do some computation locally if we want to do it reliably. Because anything that is based on assumptions about tree structure or any structure will probably fail some corner cases.
Well, that was actually one of the motivations for this whole discussion, is that in Istio, we have like the root of the tree, and like the final output of like generating XGS is like so far disconnected that we try and put these optimizations like, oh, we got a service, only annotations change. I hope that means nothing will change in the XGS, so let's just skip it. But we don't actually know that. It's just like a human observation that could easily be wrong.
Yep.
If we were more disciplined, you could have like each layer can only access what they said they depend on, and then that's how React works, right? If you say what you depend on and it's registered, and then everything kind of flows through.
Yeah, but the ship has sailed. The APIs are already in Kubernetes far too intertwined, and it will be wonderful. I completely agree with you that it would have been nice to keep this in mind when we started, but I'm afraid it's too late for this now. Unless you have a magic solution.
I guess I am curious, like, I feel like a lot of implementations are probably doing something similar to us, where you have the like GKV from things like reference grant. So you have some way to query, like, I guess the difficult part is like Kubernetes controller that like lets you know that a resource changed without telling you like past state and current state. So that's what kind of necessitates the read the whole world and hope that performance is handled as best as possible by the Kubernetes API caching layer, rather than trying to like build and save state internally. But yeah, I guess like I could see a way to have a more local caching layer of some sort based on like current and past state, but that would require like abstraction and saving a lot of stuff that I don't know how beneficial it would be. Just like it could be potentially cheaper, but it also introduces more overhead.
All right, well, this was really useful. Thanks. If I actually make this into something, I'll share the doc with all of you guys.
Cool.
Yeah, please do.
All right. Is there anything else, or should we wrap up? All right. Well, we'll end a little bit early today. Thanks, y'all. It's been great talking to you. And take care and have a good rest of the day.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah, good talking. See you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.